World War II, Sergeant First Class. That was 3 stripes up, 2 down. And I was drafted in October 1944. The Belgian Bulge was what got me in the war. I was working at where I was deferred, and I had 2 children, and that Belgian Bulge required a lot of extra troops, and I ended up getting drafted at that time. I was drafted into the Army. When I went to Fort Lewis, they loaded us up here in Pendleton on the train and took us to Fort Lewis, and the only thing that they were accepting at that time was Army, or I could have been in the Navy, and I figured I'd be happier on land than I would out there in the middle of the ocean, so I told them I'd be a pretty good foot soldier. And then I went to California to Camp Roberts, and at Camp Roberts they interviewed us, give us a lot of tests, and there was 10,000 soldiers arrived in the shipment when I did, and the only thing they had open at that time was, of course it was Army, but they had a mechanics course open for about 50 people. And the fellow that interviewed me down there told me that that was about the only specialty group out of the 10,000 people they had. Well, that was about all that was available in the way of a specialty training. And he asked me if I was a mechanic, and I said no. And he said, well, why don't you take the test anyhow? So I took the test, and the first thing he asked me was, what was a spline? And I had no idea. And every question he asked me, I had no idea. And so I knew I wasn't going to be a mechanic. The next morning they lined up 10,000 people up on the parade grounds there at Camp Roberts, and that was a enormous parade ground. There was 100 and some thousand people, soldiers there. And when they got through calling the groups off, why, I was standing there myself. And the first sergeant or whoever was calling them off come over, and he says, what's your name? And I told him. He said, well, I don't know where you're supposed to go, but he said, your name isn't on these orders. He said, are you anything special? And I said, I don't think so. And so he said, well, go back to barracks and just stick around there. And he says, when your name shows up, I'll come and get you. So the next morning, I was still there, and he said, I don't know what happened. He said, but your name isn't here. I said, well, I'll go home if you want me to. And he said, no, it won't work that way. He says, it'll show up. So he said, you can go to the PX and everything, but he said, just don't leave the area. And he said, and when your name shows up, I'll come and get you. So after a while, he come and got me. He said, why didn't you tell me you was a mechanic? I said, hell, I didn't know I was a mechanic. And anyhow, I was one of them. They picked 32 out of that, and I was one of them. I had 6 weeks of basic training walking the hills down in Camp Roberts. And then I had, let's see, out of the 13 weeks, then I had 7 weeks of mechanic training. And, of course, I moved into a barracks where there was 30-some people that were mechanics. I mean, they knew all there was about tearing up a motor or a transmission or anything else, and I knew nothing. And so I listened. When we completed the 13 weeks, I was one of 5 that was chosen out of that group of mechanics to go back to Fort Benning and go to the automotive school back there, which was about a 5 or 6 months course. I went to school all day at the automotive school down there. And again, here I was with 6 or 8 weeks of automotive schooling in with people that have been mechanics all their life. And I was, of course, I was 22 years old, and I had been in school or taken courses, college courses, all the time prior to going in the service, and that's why I retained the information pretty good. But anyhow, our tests down there at this automotive school would be, they would take a transmission apart, I mean just a bunch of little parts, or take the motor apart, takes the carburetor apart, put them on a piece of canvas and shake them up, and who could put them together the fastest so that they'd work was got the A's. And so I got to be a good mechanic, and we had to work on all the military vehicles. And so I completed that course, and they had, before I completed it, the war in Europe was over, and but the one in Pacific was still going. When I completed, I could have went on to officers' school if I would have signed up for 2 years, and I wouldn't do it because I wanted out of the service as soon as possible. I didn't want to make it any career. So anyhow, they shipped me to Fort Ord, and at Fort Ord we were going to be the invasion force that went into Japan. And we trained for that at Fort Ord. And just about, I don't know, I might have been on board the ship when Japan surrendered. I don't think I was. The peace treaty was signed in Japan. Japan, a week after we went right to Atsugi Air Force Base. We were, if not the first, we were certainly one of the first American soldiers in Japan. And because we were on a big ship, and there was one heck of a lot of soldiers on there. And they took us out to this Atsugi, and there they assigned us our duties. I was assigned to the 43rd. They went back to your peacetime job, and I was in heavy equipment and construction. And so they assigned me to the 43rd Engineer Construction Battalion. And it was at Irumagawa, Japan. And so we moved there in the barracks. And then I poured cement. I was in charge of the cement. We poured floors for mess halls and hospitals and barracks pretty fast. In the morning they said, "This is your job for the day, go run it." Well, when you got up to a special piece of equipment, you probably was going to stay on it. But when I got over there, the thing that we had going for us was a lot of those people that were there that come in with the 43rd had enough points to go home, but before they could leave, they had to train someone to take their job. So if you were a pretty good student, you could do whatever you wanted because they were eager to get home. I had a lot of opportunities to learn how to operate any piece of equipment that was there, and I did. I operated them all.